Good evening, everyone. My name is Samuel Kim, and I am the co-editor-in-chief of the Cornell Review. The Cornell Review is the alternative voice on Cornell's campus. We are a student publication whose mission is to provide conservatives, libertarians, and heterodox thinkers with the opportunity to present insightful and well-written analysis on issues facing our community. We also strive to keep everyone informed of developments both on campus and beyond, whether it is updates from our faculty senate or the recent launch of the Equal Protection Project by a law school in Cornell Law School, our law school professor locally. Part of our mission is to host events that inform the public, and we hope tonight's event, Climate Change, What They Rarely Teach in College, will be no exception. With that, I will introduce tonight's speaker. Stephen Einhorn is an alumnus of Cornell University. He graduated from Cornell in 1964 with a bachelor's degree in chemistry and went on to earn his master's in polymeric materials from Brooklyn Polytech Institute. Mr. Einhorn then led a mergers and acquisitions company for over 3 decades, specializing in transactions within the chemicals industry. And today he is a general partner at the Wisconsin-based Capital Midwest Fund. Mr. Einhorn is also the author of the recently published book, Climate Change, What They Rarely Teach in College. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Einhorn.
Good evening. Sam Ken has done a remarkable job, and the Cornell Review has been very gracious to encourage me to come today, and I'm glad to be here. And also want to thank Cornell University, my alma mater, for being here. About 60 years ago, when I was here, but I was on your side of the room, I saw Martin Luther King and Peter, Paul, and Mary, and it was wonderful. And today I'm going to speak about global warming and climate change, and it's going to be just as exciting for me. But first, I wanted to talk about those who believe that climate change is a serious problem, because there are a lot of folks who are afraid of what climate change may cause, what problems we may have. And the leaders of this group are really the climate activists or alarmists, because they believe that something should be done and done right now. Now, if you don't believe that there's a serious problem with global warming and climate change, then you're called a climate denier. But climate denier is much too close to Holocaust deniers. And that's the 6 million Jews that were killed and the 10 million that were murdered by the Nazis in World War II. They deny that this occurred. So no one should ever call you a denier, because you're not denying climate change. What you're doing is you're accepting that during the year, the climate changes. Summers are different than winters. That's just how it is. And you're also a realist, because at least it appears, and I'm going to give some reasons for this, that we don't have any major catastrophe ahead of us. There's nothing in sight, and there's virtually nothing that's going to happen. So my talk tonight is, as you know, climate change. What they really, it's a magic machine. It goes by itself. What they rarely teach in college. And I brought a number of copies of my book, which you can have, but there is a catch, because if you take a copy of my book, I expect you to read it. So at least you should know that that is the case. And I thought it might be good just to start with some advice relating to global warming. And the advice is this, that if you're a boy and you're going to meet a girl and you want to talk, you should always start with global warming. It's an icebreaker. So let's talk about the problems of global warming. Expense is a major problem. The Green New Deal is going to cost $37 trillion if we pass it for climate change. That's $100,000 per person. That means your share of the government debt will be $100,000. And after 10 years, it's going to be $200,000 because of the interest. The $1.7 trillion Deficit Reduction Act includes $400 billion for climate change. Now, politicians are absolute geniuses because only someone who is very creative could possibly call a $1.7 trillion bill a Deficit Reduction Act. And finally, the Paris Agreement is scheduled to cost $100 billion a year in the future. And of course, as you'd expect, China pays nothing. So let's read from Greta Thunberg, a leading activist. Around the year 2030, we will set off an irreversible chain reaction beyond our control that will most likely lead to catastrophe. Our lives are in your hands. How dare you to continue to look away from global warming and come here saying that you are doing enough? Your generation is failing us, and if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you. Okay, these are very powerful words. She is an extremely effective spokesperson. She's brilliant. And she's spoken to Congress, she's spoken to Parliament, other major entities. She has 2.5 million people on Facebook, and she promotes guilt and misery. This is a problem. It's not good for people to feel miserable. The Earth is getting so hot that temperatures in about a decade will probably blow past a level of warming that world leaders have sought to prevent. This is the climate activist view. It's guided by the UN IPCC, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are the world's leading activists. The Paris Agreement has told us that if temperatures increase by 1 degree Celsius, that we're going to have a catastrophe. This you know. The Earth has warmed 1 degree Celsius in 140 years, according to Berkeley Earth, and everyone accepts this. There's virtually no disagreement, and everyone agrees that fossil fuels contributes to a warmer Earth. In 2016, as you can see over here, was our warmest year, the warmest year during our lifetimes. How many of you knew this? Okay. This is a very important fact. Everyone should know this if they're interested in climate change. Now, mathematically, based upon the last 7 years, assuming that 7 years represents the climate, there's less than a 50% probability that we will have any increase in global warming in the future, right? If the last 6 years were cooler, the odds of getting higher than 2016 are much less than 50%. But the activists claim that it's extreme warmth in our future that's going to destroy us there. But how can they be so confident that that's the case? I believe this is one reason that the activists changed their wording from global warming to climate change. Temperature decline, 1944 to 1976. This is over 30 years. During these 30 years, the Earth was cooler. So what was all that carbon dioxide doing for 30 years instead of heating up the Earth? Extreme temperatures have gone both ways. This is just a few months ago. And Montana and Wyoming had the coldest weather ever. It's remarkable. But the climate activists believe that global warming is also responsible for global cooling. That is, we have the warmest temperatures and the coldest temperatures because of carbon dioxide. It's a remarkable claim. Okay. Now this chart's kind of complicated, but it's cool. And it comes from Professor Nir Sharviv at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Now, the heat, that is thermal radiation, is measured in watts per square meter. and over 300 watts per square meter comes directly from the sun. We've had an increase of carbon dioxide over the past 100 years from 200 degrees, pardon me, from 200 parts per million to 400 parts per million. That's 0.5%. So it's basically the sun that's controlling our heat. Carbon dioxide is truly minimal. Now, you probably have heard how heat is killing lots of people. But here's a study that shows that it's cold that's killing people many more times than heat. The blue is the cold, the red is the heat. And you can see from this chart that if we had more heat, fewer people would die. In 60 years, atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased 100 parts per million, and now it's 400 parts per million. Everyone agrees with this. And everyone agrees that this increase is partially due to fossil fuels, coal, gas, oil. Of all the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide usually gets top billing because it accounts for 80% of total greenhouse gases. Al Gore, An Inconvenient Truth. This is the single most famous environmental book and movie of all time. Have any of you read this? Yeah, okay. So let's see how well Al Gore knows his environmental science. Okay. So carbon dioxide is about 4% of greenhouse gases. Water vapor is 95%. This is by numbers of molecules. So he was wrong. Carbon dioxide is not 80%, it's 4%. Now, if you read Gore's book, the entire book, there are two words that are not in it. These words are water vapor. So how can water vapor be such a high percentage of greenhouse gases and Gore not mention it? I think about that. The climate alarmists tell us that carbon dioxide is a pollutant, but all plants and trees would die without it. Because, as you know, the plants absorb CO2 and then they release oxygen. That's how it works. The more CO2 that they get, the plants can open up their surface amount of pores and they can absorb more CO2. The result is that the earth becomes greener. If the plants didn't release oxygen, there'd be no human life on Earth. Now, the Paris Agreement warns us of serious problems. Here we are. Any temperature rise higher than 1/2 degree Celsius today is a disaster. 1 degree Celsius hotter than today by 2050 is a catastrophe. Climate change has cost Europe alone $160 billion in the last decade. That is, we lost $160 billion because we heated up and had too much CO2. The global economy will lose up to 18% if no action is taken to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And finally, 1 million lives will be lost due to air pollution if the Paris goals are not met. Okay, so these are the claims that we read every day. And these are the common claims for the moment. But actually, the Paris Agreement has no chance. There's almost zero chance that it will have any impact on fossil fuel emissions. And we know this. We know this because China and India are generating coal, and they're producing more coal every year and will for the next 40 years, according to their plans. And coal is the fossil fuel that creates the most CO2. So any reductions that we have in the US will be offset by China and India. They will have no impact on global warming and climate change. So let's see what happened during the last 100 years when temperatures have increased 1 degree centigrade. You've seen that the Paris Agreement is telling us we have a disaster coming for the next 100 years or whatever we have. So let's see what happened during the past 100 years. Because during the last 100 years, the temperatures rose by 1 degree Celsius. Since 1900, wealth has increased over 70 times. Okay. Since 1981, poverty has decreased from 55 to 20%. Since 1829, literacy has increased from 20% to 80%. Since 1840, lifespan has increased by 20 years. So what's happened? What's happened during the past 100 years? What's happened is that we have more wealth, less poverty, and more literacy. And what does the Paris Agreement tell us? It says the opposite. We have another degree of Celsius, we have a disaster. We're going to be poorer, we're going to be stupider, and we're going to have shorter lives. Why? Totally inconsistent with history. In the year 2100, 2 billion people, about 1/5 of the world's population, could become climate change refugees due to rising ocean levels, Cornell Chronicle. The Department of Homeland Security report warns that as many as 143 million people were likely to be displaced by 2050 because of climate change. Okay, so this is sea rise. Sea rise is the single most frightening aspect of climate change. Everyone will agree that if the sea rises a lot, we're in a lot of trouble. So what do we have? Here we have, here's a typical picture. This is a picture to scare us. This is what's going to happen, according to the alarmists, according to the Paris Agreement. This is what we expect when the sea level rises. Okay, but let's see what's happening in the real world. This is New York City, population 8 million. This shows a constant increase every year, no acceleration. This is about 1 foot in 100 years. This is another picture of New York City. This is one that shows acceleration. But there's no acceleration. There's no increase. The sea outside of New York City is rising at 1 inch every 8 years. And at this rate, it's going to rise less than 1 foot by 2100. However, the US government projects at least 2 feet increase, and the UN projects 3 feet. Why? There's no historic justification for this. So let's look at the other major seacoast cities in the world. Buenos Aires, population 15 million. Sea level rises 4 millimeters a year. This is a straight line. There's no acceleration in the sea level rise. Calcutta, India, population 15 million, no acceleration. Los Angeles, 4 million people, no acceleration. Mumbai, India, 21 million people, no acceleration. Shanghai, China, 26 million, no acceleration. Tokyo, Japan, population 37 million, no acceleration. These 7 cities are among the largest, they are the largest seacoast cities in the world where measurements have been taken. The total population is over 100 million. There's been no acceleration for 50 to 100 years. None. This is from the government. This is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. That's what they do. They measure. So let's think about it. Yep, these are the 7 cities. This is what's there. This is a world graph of sea level rise according to NASA. The seas have risen 3.4 millimeters a year, 1 inch every 8 years. There's a straight line, there's no acceleration. Let's see how Al Gore did on sea level rise. We want to give him another chance. Okay, so here's Gore's prediction. In the near term, the sea is going to rise 20 feet. The US government, NASA, actual, last 15 years, 2 inches. He missed. This is not a miss. This is a myth. You can't be 99% wrong, and anybody should believe you. Why should anyone believe Al Gore's predictions? You can't be this wrong and have any knowledge whatsoever of reality. You guys are in luck, because I'm going to read this slide twice. Why is there a disagreement? The alarmists use computer models that incorporate many uncertain values and even outright guesses. The realists forecast a continuation of past trends. This is what's happening. I'm reading again. Alarmists use computer models that incorporate many uncertain values and even outright guesses. The realists forecast a continuation of past trends. This is what's happening. And at Cornell, unfortunately, there are too many people who have no clue that this is what's really happening. It's really sad because we have smart, competent people here, and they're being fed information which is just not accurate. So this is a picture of the alarmists versus the actual sea rise. You saw there's not one place on Earth that's been identified by the UN or the IPCC where anything they claim in terms of accelerated sea rise has happened. Nothing. That's this brown line. See, the sea rose, accelerated 3 times between 1900 and today, and it's going to rise another 3 times between now and 2100. That's what's going to happen. It's going to accelerate. But it doesn't accelerate. The reason that the UN, IPCC, and all of their scientists get this wrong is because they're not measuring sea level rise. What they measure is glaciers, a polar melting, barometric pressure, temperature, and the actual increase in sea rise is truly minimal in their consideration. So to measure the sea rise, they're not measuring the sea rise. No matter who you are or how smart you are or what title you have or how many papers your site has published, if the prediction is wrong, your hypothesis is wrong. Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner, physics, 1965. This is why the UN is wrong and the activists are wrong, because their hypothesis is wrong. They should concentrate on actual sea rise. I know I spent a lot of time on this because this is really important for people to understand that there is no problem with sea rise. If they understand that there's no problem with sea rise, they won't be frightened about climate change. I don't believe.
We're taking questions.
Go for it.
Since 2016, what are the level rise or fall look like? 2016 to 2020.
It's the same. It is possible that the sea is accelerating by 1 or 2 inches per century there. It's possible, but it's truly meaningless in terms of the whole picture there. And actually, when you go back to that, it's kind of interesting, the chart from 2016 to 2021, because remember 2020. In 2020, everything closed, right? Nobody flew planes, nobody drove automobiles, nobody went to class. Right, there was a year of saving. It actually represented the largest reduction in history of climate change, or I should say global warming, CO2 use. It's just the absolute, it was the year that we actually saved 9% of all carbon dioxide going out into the atmosphere. Now, it also was the 2nd warmest year ever. It's almost as warm as 2016. On the other hand, 2021, remember the planes started flying, people went back to work, went back to school, people went in automobiles. That was a much cooler year than 2020. So you have exactly the opposite effect here, but most folks anywhere, including Cornell, don't know this. And so they can't factor this in when they make decisions. So they're basically told what we hear from the New York Times, which is everything is a disaster. Okay, hurricanes. There's been no increase in hurricanes and cyclones in 50 years. The chart, right? This is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. There's been no increase whatsoever. Major tornadoes in the US. Okay, we actually have fewer tornadoes. That's what's actually happening. Yeah.
What would you say to the claim that that's climate change? Is it increasing the frequency? I mean, frequency of hurricanes, but it's increasing its intensity. What would you say to that?
It's a very good question because there have been studies of intensity. When you actually look at it, the studies of intensity show a 2% increase in intensity. Okay, 2% is within the confidence level, what's going on. It's totally meaningless. You know, if a hurricane is going 100 30 miles an hour. And all of a sudden, because of whatever reason, I'm not going to say it's climate change because I don't believe it, but let's say it's going 133 miles an hour. This has no effect on anything whatsoever. But because some guy did a study that showed a 2% increase, that's it. That means, oh, this is terrible. So this is just proof of climate change, which it really isn't. Climate change it's so complicated, really. You know, they have you can have 200 or 300 variables in doing your calculation. You can't get it straight. That's why it's so much better just to measure what's actually happening. Fact check. How global warming has increased U.S. wildfires. In the midst of record or near record heat waves across the Northern Hemisphere, deadly wildfires have swept through many regions. This has focused public attention on the role that climate change plays in wildfires. There's a very famous professor, David Cullen, who said, anyone who believes a fact checker at face value is an idiot, and that's a fact. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, I also said that the more fact checkers, the more likely it is to be true.
Got it. That's right. That was a poem. So what about fires? This is the US government, the National Interagency Fire Center. And they tell us, if you look at the red line, that there's been no increase. In fact, there's been a significant decrease during the past 100 years in acreage burned. The blue line shows carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide goes straight up and there's no effect whatever on fires. But there's more to it, really. Because human carelessness, arson, utilities cause over 80% of all fires. This according to the National Fire Service. So if we have 80% of the fires caused by humans, it doesn't really pay to spend a lot of time trying to get the other 20% down 1%. You might as well concentrate on the human causes because that's just rational there. And you remember Smokey the Bear, only you can prevent forest fires? Well, Smokey was right. Get Greta Thunberg again. We need Greta's help. She's a leader. All right. Nearly all coral reefs will disappear over the next 20 years. It's a very clear statement, right? She's not mincing her words. She never does. Okay, but is it true? So this is a picture of Palau, P-A-L-A-U. This is a group of islands north of Australia, very, very close to the equator. If it's close to the equator, the temperatures have the water has high temperatures, right? And also it's a little more acidic. It's still basic, but it's more acidic than most other places in the world. So what happened in Palau about 2000 was they had a lot of trouble with the coral reefs. There was a lot of bleaching and they had big problems. So what they did is they passed some laws. And the laws basically said, no suntan lotion. And let's stop throwing refuse into the ocean. So this is now current. That's what the coral reefs look like. So if we want to keep the coral reefs, we have to stop using the same suntan lotions, and we have to stop throwing garbage where they live. This was also true for the Great Barrier Reef. Now, the Great Barrier Reef, as you know, is the largest coral reef in the world. And they were suffering too, but they've come back. And the reason they've come back, that is, the corals have come back, is because the runoff from the farms has been reduced. And it was the runoff from the farms that we believe was causing the bleaching that's there. Now, if you go to Australia, they'll still show you the few parts which are bleaching because it's desirable politically, I think would be a good way to put it. Okay. So, U.S. and Canadian scientists warn that we may lose most of the world's polar bears by the end of the century as climate change melts the sea ice around the Arctic. Climate change is already starving polar bears and may wipe out most of them by 2100. Okay, so now we know what's happening, right? The activists are telling us that they're drowning because of the loss of ice, and they're starving because they can't kill walruses anymore. Terrible situation. But actually, the polar bear populations have grown. We have 3 times as many polar bears as we had in 1970. And there's a reason for this. Because they weren't never drowning and they were not starving. They were being shot. And since the 1970s, when the major countries that had polar bears got together, they passed a law, you're not allowed to shoot a polar bear. So polar bears have affirmative action. You can't shoot them. And if you do, you have real trouble. But here's the problem. Polar bears are really cute. And the alarmists are very smart. And the alarmists need money because everyone loves the beautiful polar bears. They claim that the polar bears are drowning and starving, but they're not. So save your money for worthwhile causes. Okay. So extinct animals. In 2007, by the way, this is Al Gore's last chance. Al Gore, in An Inconvenient Truth, predicted 16 specific animals would become extinct, gone. Okay, so let's see what happened. So here's one that Gore claimed was going to become extinct. It's a Hawaiian tree frog. Well, they've become invasive in Hawaii, and the concentrations are up to 20,000 frogs per acre. So if Gore wants to know about this tree frog, he should call Pest Control Hawaii. It's at 808-378-1866. Okay, let's do another animal. It's kind of fun. All right, the golden toad. Gore predicted that this would become extinct in 2007. And to an extent, he was right. His problem was timing, because his timing was bad. The golden toad had already become extinct 10 years earlier, and that was due to a virus. It had nothing to do with global warming. In total, Gore was wrong on all 16 animals that he claimed would be extinct. Nothing occurred as he predicted. And so why should we listen to this guy? Now, I wanted Greta Thunberg to chime in also, right? We're in the midst of a 6th mass extinction with about 200 species going extinct every single day. Almost 30,000 species face extinction because of human activity. Okay, so how many of you can name two animals that anybody's heard of in the last couple of years that's gone extinct? I can't even think of one. There was a study done by 360 Yale. They studied the last 400 years. And altogether, for all reasons altogether, and humans were responsible for a number of these for reasons we could talk about. But there are only 2 animals that were extinct each year for 400 years. That's it. So this bit about 30,000 species is interesting. It's a good number, but it's just not accurate there. So we shouldn't listen to Greta while she shouts at us. Okay. Burning fossil fuels creates harmful air pollution that can worsen heart disease. Yeah, okay. So this is a claim that fossil fuels are killing Americans by polluting our air, and they're causing heart disease. Well, let's see what happened. Okay, so here's a map. Now look at Los Angeles. The reason to look at Los Angeles, because this is a map of unhealthy air pollution. That's with ozone and then particles combined. And Los Angeles had over 1,000 days in the last 10 years where the air was polluted. So clearly there must be more people dying from heart disease in Los Angeles than most other places. But no, actually, Los Angeles had they had fewer deaths, only 190 per 100,000 people, compared to the average, which is 210. So there is absolutely no correlation between heart disease and fossil fuel pollution. Okay, so it's time for silent reading. You just can't make lots of stuff without fossil fuels. You certainly cannot make wind turbines, solar panels, or electric cars. Industry works every day to use less fossil fuels. It saves money. This is a company actually that I've worked with along with 2 other Cornell alumni engineers. It's liquid cooling of computer. And all of your computers and all my computers, they're all air cooled, right? You got fans and motors, uses a lot of electricity. It's kind of like if you have a glass, you want a glass of water, And you put some water in, it gets cold, or you can shoot 800 times that amount of air to get it cold. Air is just ineffective. Liquids are much more effective for cooling computers. Well, this technology for data centers could save 13 million tons of carbon dioxide in a year. Now, it's much better. That's just about as much as we're going to save if we save anything from the Deficit Reduction Act of $400 billion. Now, are we better off spending $400 billion on the Deficit Reduction Act for wind and solar and cars? Are we better developing technologies like this that'll save a ton of energy and cost us nothing extra? Okay, so let's talk about wind turbines here. Government supports these, but one wind turbine uses 45 tons of plastic, 900 tons of steel, 25 tons of concrete, 2 tons of rare earth elements which are non-renewable. Now, if you want to decommission these things, it's very expensive. A wind turbines cost over $100,000 to decommission. And in 8 years, it's going to cost $12 billion to dispose of these wind turbines. Land is expensive, very expensive. If you take 300 square miles of wind turbines, that can be replaced with 20 acres of fossil fuels. Fossil fuel plant of 20 acres equals 300 square miles of wind turbines. How about solar energy? Well, these require a lot of toxic materials, lead, cadmium, indium. And solar energy, it has 300 times more toxic waste than nuclear, which everybody's afraid of would be toxic waste. And by 2050, these worn-out solar panels are going to double the tonnage of all the globe's plastic waste. So here's the overwhelming question. Are renewable energies, wind and solar energies, really the best solution, both environmentally and sustainable for humanity? It's an important question. So here we are. Wind and solar kill over 1 million birds yearly. The wind farms slice off their wings, and the solar incinerates them and they explode in flames. It's hard to see how this can be beneficial environmentally. Here's another example. These are the humpback whales. We now have 30% less over in the New York waters. This is because the loud sound blasts from boats during the installation of the wind turbines, it interferes with the whales' hearing and communications. They go offshore and they die. We haven't exactly proven the connection, but we do know that we have 30% less humpback whales than when we started putting in wind energy. So, of course, we have to talk about Tesla. Everybody knows that electric vehicles save energy, and they're good for the environment, except are they? One car requires 140 pounds of lithium carbonate and processes 500,000 pounds of earth. If you're in California, you average 5,200 miles per year driving a Tesla. It'll take 100,000 miles to break even on the energy that you use between the creation and the demolition of the car. It's going to take you almost 20 years to get even. Climate change is perhaps the greatest wealth transfer to the rich in history. Did you know that? Well, since you didn't know it, I'm going to read it again. Climate change is perhaps the greatest wealth transfer to the rich in history. Frightening. We're transferring money to wealthy people. The poor don't buy Teslas. There have been 2.5 million sold. They sell at an average price of $66,000 per car. Not one poor person has bought a Tesla. The poor don't buy wind turbines or get the benefits from tax credits or subsidies. And the poor don't buy solar panels, which get the benefits of subsidies and tax credits. And this is not a little deal, guys. This is $1 trillion. Since 2000, governments have given away to the rich $1 trillion. The Deficit Reduction Act was $400 billion. That's 400 out of 1.7 billion for this act, and that 400 billion was for Teslas and cars, wind turbines, and solar panels. Al Gore's picture's here because he's one of the richest men in the world. He has a net worth of over 300 million. He pulls in over $2 million a month for his climate change business. And he's promoting that we should spend another $4 trillion on this. Just did it a couple of months ago. What do you think? Good idea? So this is a summary. There's been no increase in temperature for 6 years. The sea level is not rising any faster. There's been no increase in hurricanes and tornadoes. There's less acreage of fires burned, and most of them are human caused. There are virtually no extinct animals. The coral reefs are not headed for extinction. CO2 is good for the planet, just ask the trees. And as far as climate catastrophe, there's none in sight. There's no sign that there's anything in sight. Well, the question is, why do most people in the world, certainly most people in Cornell, believe that we have a serious climate change problem? I want to go over why, because it's important to see the tactics and efforts of the climate activists, which are right around us. Headline: Alarmists claim that climate change has doubled the size of forest fires in Western U.S. This actually gets written in the paper almost every month. But we know that there are fewer forest fires. So where do they get this from? They don't get it from the U.S. government. Government's saying the opposite. Heat-related deaths are expected to rise after 1.7 million people died in 2019 due to extreme temperatures, New York Times. If you actually read the article, you'll see the article explains that it's cold weather that's causing most of these temperature deaths, not hot weather. But that's not how the headline reads. And many people, maybe most people, only read the headlines to get this distorted information. Language distortion. Claiming weather is climate. Oh, really? Weather. Weather is the state of the atmosphere at a particular time and place. Climate is the usual weather conditions over a period of years. If you listen to CNN, you'll hear that one hurricane like Ida is an indication of climate change. But it confuses us. It's a very, very minimal relationship between one hurricane and climate change. Because one hurricane is not an indication of climate change. It takes years of hurricanes to indicate a change in climate. And there's been no increase in hurricanes for 50 years. Some people will say, well, 7 years isn't enough. You really have to go 100 years. You got to go back and say, well, over 100 years, temperatures have increased by 1 degree Celsius. That's more like it. Well, you can do that. But if you go back 1,000 years, we had the same temperature 1,000 years ago as we had today. And if they really believe that 100 years is right, then let's stop claiming that one hurricane or one tornado or one climatic event is an indication of climate change. It just isn't. Climate is weather conditions over many years. Hiding mistakes. This one is harder to find because the mistakes are hidden. But this is a chart. It's a chart from the UN, from the IPCC. It's a chart of their predictions. It's over 100 predictions. Every one was wrong. How can you be wrong 102 out of 102 times? With an average of 3 times wrong. You see the blue, those blue circles? That's what actually the temperature was. The red, that represents the UN, IPCC, and all of their scientists and geniuses that are predicting climate change. Controlling funding. All monies for climate research go to climate alarmists. every penny. Now, does anyone here know of any penny from government monies that went to realists who didn't believe that we had a climate change problem? Is there even a penny here at Cornell? We get lots of money for this. There's not. And my guess is that none of you believe we could get a penny for this. It's just not going to happen. So everything that I've told you today, people who believe that are not going to get a penny out of the $3 billion from the federal government. This is a very effective way of controlling minds, because every study you see is paid, that's paid for by the government, says exactly the opposite of most everything that I've tried to explain today. Censorship, censorship, just preventing opposing ideas from reaching the public. Look in Google. Look up any of the topics that I've brought up. Look up sea levels having flat growth for 100 years. You can't find it. It might be on page 9 of Google, because Google has a very special way of providing the truth. Look up decrease in forest fires on Google. See if you can find it. Bet you it's a challenge. What about the coral reefs not dying and becoming extinct? Look for that. I don't think you'll find all of these challenging. And so you can't blame people for actually believing that climate change is a problem, because the social media is totally one-sided. And you only get the opposite view, even if it's scientifically incorrect. Okay, so here's a summary. How do the alarmists fight fake news? Why is it so effective? Because they use false and selective facts, bad assumptions, language distortion, hiding mistakes, controlling funding, scaring people, censorship, and intimidation and guilt. It's a very powerful strategy, and it works. There are 3 points that I'd like you to remember. The first is that the Earth has been cooler for the past 6 years. It's a fact. This is coming from the US government, from the NOAA, from NASA, from Berkeley Labs. Every group agrees that 2016 was the warmest year. The New York Times will report 2020 was almost as warm as 2016, almost a tie, because they got to show that we're having an increase. But as I pointed out, 2020 was the year we used the least amount of carbon dioxide in the past decade. The second point is that the seas have risen at a constant rate with virtually no acceleration. The UN takes the opposite position, but I've spoken to leaders in this, or at least one leader, and I asked her, can you name one spot on Earth that confirms your prediction? And she couldn't. Not one spot on Earth. So it's not true. That's what science does, right? You check reality against what you might believe. And the third is that during the past 100 years, while CO2 has continually increased, we've become wealthier, live longer, more educated, and there's no reason for this to be reversed in the future. So this is why you should be happy. There's been no global warming. There's no global warming problem. There's no climate change problem. There's nothing to fear or worry about. And so what we should do is we should concentrate on the realization of worthy goals and happiness. We're blessed with a wonderful climate, and we should be grateful. Thank you. Go for it.
Mr. Einhorn, thank you so much for coming on this. Part of refreshing to hear this perspective. So rare. I found your argument persuasive. I just have to ask, why do you think that alarmists? Why do you think that there are alarmists? Why do you think that they exaggerate their claims so much? Because it's very difficult to refute like the mainstream claim. Because I feel like so often you'll get laughed at for like disagreeing with what everyone sees the thing. So how do we? What are your thoughts?
So how do you deal with the alarmists and the major claims? What should we do about that? How do we address that? It's really difficult and maybe impossible, because there are thousands of people making lots of money on this. And we have an educational system at most schools, most liberal schools, certainly, I'm going to say here at Cornell. I want to ask the students here, have any of you heard once that there might be a problem with the activist climate change scenario? Once. Okay, let me ask another question. I put forth a lot of thoughts here. They're not my thoughts, guys. This comes from the US government, the NOAA, NASA, EPA, and the think tanks. I'm just a student here. So how many of you think that there could be one professor at our university that could be hired that would espouse these ideas and would receive tenure? Does anyone believe it?
Not a chance.
Not a chance.
Zero.
Okay.
Less than.
This is a problem. We all love Cornell. And we want Cornell to be the sort of institution which accepts diverse ideas. The only way this can ever happen at Cornell, in my view, is to have affirmative action for people who have the opposite opinion, because it ain't going to happen through the professors, from what I've heard. And if you hear any exception to what I just said, please tell me. Anything else? Go for it.
So first, thank you so much for coming. It's again like very refreshing to hear like this alternative perspective, especially since like at least like in my experience, like I have always heard like the world's about to end. We need to do something about it. I guess like I wanted to ask you a question like that's related to this, and specifically the point that you made about many people like profiting from this, and we've seen like a rise in environmental, social, and governance activism within corporations. To what extent do you think to what extent do you believe like climate alarmism has impacted like the rise of ESG initiatives within corporations? And given that there have been like questions over whether ESG reporting is actually effective, do you think that do you believe that leaders within corporations are concerned about the alarmist, I guess, more the political consequences of projecting the orthodox view on climate change?
So the question is, how does politics and money affect climate change policy? Okay. Now, if you look over my presentation, I specifically eliminated, in almost all cases, political considerations, because I think the basis for changing people's minds is to look at the science. What we're getting is phony science. The UN IPCC is presenting phony science on the sea levels, for example. It's just not true. And they can't prove it and they can't show it. And it's contrary to all measurements of sea levels. As I said, there may be 1 or 2 inches a year, a century, but it's truly minimal if there is any acceleration. And my theory is that we should avoid the politics until people understand the science of what's happening, because we're always told, hey, the science consensus, 97% of all scientists believe that we have a serious problem. Okay, so let me tell you where that came from. John Cook wrote an article about 15 years ago on this, and he claimed that 97% of 12,000 papers all confirmed that human activity was the major cause of global warming, fossil fuels, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, all that stuff. But when you actually go through his papers, it's not true. Because two-thirds of the papers had no comment whatsoever about human activity. And where he got it was 33 out of 34% remaining actually mentioned that there is a human factor. Not that it was important. It was only 1% that mentioned that human factors were important at that time. So he takes 33, divides it by 34, and he gets 97%. And that's the basis of this. But it's not true, because we've had groups, we've had 30,000 scientists claim, including Edward Teller, with different meetings and stuff, claim there is no problem whatsoever. But these are ignored, and then we're told that these people aren't real scientists the way that other scientists were. So it is true, this is highly political, and it does affect wealth in very many ways. But that's not my goal here. My goal is to concentrate on the science, because my belief is if people understand the science, if you believe there's no problem, you're not going to spend money on no problem. So everything else goes away. I know I ducked the question, but I did it intentionally for the reasons that I explained.
I'd like to make a comment as a scientist. So I don't do climate change. And, but I know optics and I know thermodynamics really well that relate to this. And so I imagine a number of you are economics majors. And if you are, then you have a model. And as a matter of fact, the conclusion has to equal the assumptions, otherwise it's not the equation. So the assumptions are just the most fundamental thing to the bet. And so for the climate change models, the most fundamental equation is that equation that relates to temperature change to the CO2 concentration. And that equation has a climate sensitivity factor. I have never asked. And when anybody speaks the mantra of climate change, I ask them, can you tell me how this equation was taken out by the sensitivity? The last person I asked was our dean, who came in talking about climate change. No, I have not gotten a yes answer in a dozen years. And I give my students an automatic A+ if they can describe that to me. And I haven't given an A+ yet. So from the fundamental science, I believe that that's the fundamental equation for all the other equations and the chemistry. And there's probably not anybody working on climate science that I haven't asked.
So thank you for that. Last semester I took Bruce Monger's oceanography class, and essentially the entire class is just preaching climate points. But one part of the class that really convinced me was a discussion of the coral reefs and that and their decline in population over the past 50 years. And I don't know, I guess, could you expand more on why you think that the main cause of coral reef decline is pollutants in the water as opposed to acidification?
So the question is, why are pollutants in the water causing the coral reefs to disappear? And the answer is that whenever you eliminate the human factor, they do fine. That's just reality. Look, in Puerto Rico, they had leaking oil that was killing the reefs. In Australia, they had this runoff from the water. In Palo, they had suntan lotion. They've had suntan lotion that have been eliminated from most coral reefs right now throughout the world. So if the suntan lotion isn't a factor, then why are all these places eliminating suntan lotion? Where they want because they want the coral reefs. They're great for tourists. You make money on the tourists. But if you have bleached coral reefs, you don't make any money. So you got to get rid of the suntan lotion. It's just reality. Why not ask him about suntan lotions and ask him about what's happened in Palo? And here's another part that's so sad. The article that I took about Palo, in order to get that published, the fellow had to write, yeah, the coral reefs are doing really well in Palo. And that we think that's because we eliminated suntan lotions and we stopped the runoff from the land. But we have to acknowledge that global warming is a major problem. He had to put that in, even though it has nothing to do with his article, because he couldn't get it published in a major magazine if he didn't put that in. You have to take one side of climate change and global warming, or you're not going to be accepted. So that's just how it is. Go ahead.
Dave Collins, chemistry. I have a minor question. I want to figure out this is going to be that much of a problem. I'm in a doctor's Zoom group talks about COVID. There's an NSA guy who says, be careful about bringing science into the debate because you exclude 98% of the population. I think he's correct. Just as you get too sciencey, also everyone says, "Ah, that's over my head." They throw up their hands. So the way I go at this, and what worked for me back in 2016, my story was, I knew that I couldn't understand the story. I had to put in the hours. I sat in my office to the Secretary of Energy and told him that I was agnostic. He blew a snot ball about that. And I said, it would take me 10,000 hours to figure this out. But what worked for me was when a couple of people prodded me and I said, everyone believes it. And they sent me a list of famous scientists that did it. And I first thought they were going to be from Sheboygan State College. And I'd say, I don't care. There might be nice people. But that's not what I want to hear.
That's in Wisconsin. Be very careful.
From Sheboygan State College. It was from Stanford, Harvard, Caltech, you name it. I said, okay, they probably shot down a model, and the deniers are claiming therefore climate change is not true. And so I started Googling them, and what really worked for me is after I found about 20 guys who were beyond doubt knowledgeable, who said it's total crap. Once you get a person to accept that truth, then all of a sudden they start questioning everything. And there's a reason why I'm optimistic. One is my social media feed seems to have no climate change believers anywhere near it. I've got 93,000 followers on Twitter, and I can't find a climate changer anywhere in that group. So I think there is evidence that there's a lot of people who have no voice, but don't believe it. The second thing I think that's working in our favor, the dilemma of climate change is they can tell us a story forever. And they'll always say, it's just not here yet. So it's the nastiest of all the narratives. But here's what is happening. We did discover during COVID that scientists were a complete disaster. The scientific community let us down in every imaginable way, and that story is getting out. me, it was finding former National Academy of Sciences had Sansa hoax. Finding that Steve Koonin says it's garbage. Steve will straddle the line, but only because he's doing what you said you have to do. He's trying to not be dismissed. But if you talk to him, he says the math can't possibly predict anything. You get the guy at Stanford, I'm forgetting his name, who says error propagation says there's a five-fold error bar on top of the estimate. That's like really soon at Harvard, you get guys from Oxford, and next thing you know, you can't ignore it. Shabib, right? Hebrew University, solar physicist, chair of the department, bachelor's degree at 18, writes an article in Forbes and it lasts 4 hours before it's taken down. I'm pretty sure Shabib is brilliant. And he says there's not one shred of evidence that the climate change is coming from CO2. So if you can get these kind of things out to
So your point is that if you can get any doubt,
you gotta
right.
You gotta do what the cigarette companies did. Some
So, because to a large extent,
but in this
Right.
case, we're right, not wrong.
so
You've gotta knock people off their game.
you know, the problem also is that to a lot of people,
So I do 50 podcasts here probably. The person, next time they see an article questioning it, I want them to pause just a little bit.
so what really happens, as you point out, is this is a religion.
It is a rule.
After you've been told something 100 times, it's a religion. So I want to tell you a story. It's in the book. You have to read this now because I'll tell it to you. It's a story about the citizens of Chelm. Chelm was a mythical town in Poland. And there was a dispute, a major dispute in Chelm. The question was, what's more important, the sun or the moon? And they couldn't agree. So they went to the rabbi, and the rabbi studied for a week and said, I got it. The moon is more important. So why is the moon more important? Because the sun provides light when we already have lots of light, and the moon provides light when we need it. Okay. This is what we have with climate change. We have people who are religious to it, because I've given this speech 6 times. No one has come forth with one criticism of anything I've written, which is very unusual because my wife criticizes me every day. So it's you, Nancy. So that's what we're up against. And to get away from a religion, they have to accept one thing. And my goal would be if they could just accept the fact that the seas are not rising at an accelerated rate, we win. Or if they can accept the fact that the last 6 years have been cooler, we win. Those are the 2 major facts that someone has to understand. We all know it's true. I mean, this is from the US government, guys. I didn't make this up. This is government statistics, things that they've measured there. So anyway, that's my thought. Go for it.
So I have a question about sea levels rising. The island of Majuro, which is the capital island of Nauru, which is very close to Palau, which is one of the countries you mentioned, is sinking, so to speak. The Maldives and the Indian Ocean are also sinking. Indonesia has been locating their capital off the island of up the main island. They're relocating Jakarta because the sea levels, they're concerned the city's going to flood. I mean, there's so many examples of countries investing immense amounts of money into relocating essentially tens of millions of people because they're concerned about sea level.
Where are the tens of millions of people?
In the capital of Jakarta in Indonesia.
Okay.
My question is, I think all of your statistics are very convincing about sea level rising being, not accelerating. I'm just wondering, and I believe them, I'm just wondering, why are these countries investing so much capital, poor countries investing so much capital if this is really nothing to be worried about?
There are certain areas which have more problems, as you pointed out, than others. A good example is Miami, Florida. Miami, Florida has had more flooding in the past 10 years than it had in the last 100 years. But when they did the studies, which was done by a university in Padua and also from Florida, what they found is, I'm not sure I'll pronounce this right, subsidence. It should be SIDENCE. In other words, the ground is sinking, it's compacting. And so you have a combination of the sea level rising slowly and actually the earth compacting faster. And the combination makes it look like the sea level is rising because that's the more obvious portion. So I don't know of any place in the world where the sea is rising more than 4 millimeters a year. We know, for example, in Stockholm, Sweden, it's diminishing at 4 millimeters a year. So it goes between plus and minus 4 millimeters a year throughout the entire world. And outside of Florida, when you go to, say, Cuba, which is very close, the seas are only rising there at about 3 millimeters per year, which means that Florida, and what happened in Miami is they stopped doing the measurements for Miami. I guess they were so controversial, they just stopped doing it. But that's why I went to Cuba, because Cuba's only 90 miles away, so we can get a fix of what's happening. So probably around Miami, it's actually, the seas are rising 3 millimeters a year, and the rest is compaction of the earth, which is subsiding. So I think that's what's happening. I'm not an expert on Chicago, so I don't really know.
Thank you.
Anything else?
One thing you didn't mention really at all was nuclear. I think you mentioned it in passing. What do you think about proposals to switch towards nuclear energy as opposed to solar or wind?
This is the one area where the lefties and the alarmists are coming around. Up until now, they've been afraid that there's going to be nuclear disasters everywhere. But when they've seen that nothing's happened in France for 30, 40 years, and France has done an incredible job of getting effective, low-cost energy there. I think the whole world is coming around, and that may be one of the bright spots that we can have nuclear energy, which would make a great deal of sense. It's plentiful, it's cheap, and it really is safe. They've also learned how to make very small nuclear facilities, so you can have it local and then provide a lot of energy there. So I think the world is heading toward total support of nuclear there, which was a problem because of the potential danger there. Okay, go for it.
You also didn't, I'm not sure if I missed, you also didn't actually think about developing countries, how they're staying behind fossil fuels. So I wanted to ask, how may we address that subject to be more persuasive?
Question is, what about developing countries?
Yes.
Where do they stand relating to fossil fuels and renewable energy? I'm going to give you an answer which is political. Okay. Right now, there are many developing nations which could very effectively use fossil fuels. And they're being guided by the developed countries not to use fossil fuels, but instead to use renewable energy, which is really, in many respects, less effective for what they want to accomplish. But I really want to keep away from the politics altogether. This is just my view, and you can check it out to see whether there's any accuracy to that. Did that answer the question?
Google Sri Lanka.
You want to talk there?
No, it's fascinating topic.
Yeah. Go for it.
Actually, another thing that I kind of wish you could talk about a little bit, but what about warming and cooling trends pre-measured warming? I guess our records only go back so far. Most of your graphs start out of the late 1800s or the 1900s. Can you speak to trends before that?
If you go back 1,000 years, there are periods of 100 and 200 years, which are called the early cooling period. Then there was the early heating period. This was during the Middle Ages. And it's gone up and down over the last 1,000 years. But 1,000 years ago, it was almost exactly the same as what it was today. There are charts. Greg Wrightstone wrote a book, which has a chart in it. I'm not sure whether my book actually does have a chart to that effect, but there have been warm periods and cold periods there. Also, there's this theory about the Earth as on an axis, and that changes every 18,000 years, which is how we go away from an ice age, which we had 18,000 years ago, and why this spot was 100 feet under ice then, and why we don't have that now. And the theory is it's going to retilt another, I don't know, 10,000 years, and then we'll all be gone. There. I'm not worried about 10,000 years from now. I probably won't have any effect on it.
Kind of a follow-up question. In one of my classes here at Cornell, I had a professor claim that cooling in the 1500s was a result of, also, I guess, that even caused climate change, a result of indigenous people and other people dying off across the Americas as a result of plague and colonization. What do you think of that claim that we were influencing climate even back
So
then?
we're talking about several hundred years ago. There was a cooling due to human plagues and other factors. Here's the good news. I know nothing about it, so I'm not going to answer the question.
Quick question, just going back to the point like that. A lot of scientists say that we've seen a rise in temperatures in 2020, but 2020 was like the year where we used the least amount of carbon, and then 2021, human activity resumed, like we began to travel, interact again, and temperatures actually went down. In your observations and in your view, could there have been like some sort of like a delayed effect perhaps that the reduction in carbon emissions in 2020, the effects only were observed later because like it just takes time? Just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
So the question is there a delay that this carbon dioxide has in creating either heat or cold? There's a very old joke about, I sent you 2 planes and a helicopter to save you from drowning. That's what I think applies. It just never happens. Whatever, if you make 100 predictions and they're all wrong, you try to adjust to it. So every I showed you 100 predictions that were wrong. I mean, Gore with his 20 feet most probable in the near future. These are virtually every prediction is wrong, and it's all negative. It's things we should worry about, but it doesn't happen. That's why we should be happy and gracious for what we have there.
I want to say something about this question about, so Ray Bradley published the paleo data for 300,000 years or something with temperature and CO2. So I asked him when I got to that part of my class, wrote to him and I said, have you ever done a time correlation to see which comes first? No one's, but I'm still. So the next year when I got to that, and he said, no, we never did that. It's a good thing. Well, that's the first thing I would have done. You know, that's science. So, I mean, I took my piece of paper and went across the 2 lines. And it seems to me that actually the temperature rises faster first before the CO2 does. And oddly enough, that particular graph is published backwards compared to all the other graphs. You know, it's going to be.
Right. So the comment is, it's questionable about which comes first, carbon dioxide or temperature. There seems to be information both ways or neither way, and it's just an unknown there.
I don't think that's questionable in the law. That is, there's people who've done that type of correlation. In the 400 to 600,000 year cycle, it looks like a fabulous correlation. They have found a statistically significant delay of CO2 formation 800 years after the warming. So the peaks are 800 years offset, which means that by definition, it's warming first and degassing the ocean second. Now, the other thing I like, you know, the problem is when you talk with the zealots, one of the things I say to myself, look, let's say you're right. Let's say it's going to raise 4 degrees. I can guarantee you can't see it with the naked eye. I will just hold firm and say, you think you can see it? You can't. If the ocean's rising the thickness of a dime every year, you can't see it. So if you think you can see it, you're just delusional. What was also true is that, for example, the glaciers, which are the best case, they love the glaciers. So the glaciers are receding. You got a 1920 photo, you got a 2020 photo, and the glacier way up the valley. You go, see, that's global warming. And then you ask them, do you know what they found underneath those glaciers? And the answer is 1,200-year-old trees. They grew there 1,200 years ago. Once you confront them with that, their glacier model completely falls apart. So that's a knockout punch for that glacier story. And you can then show plots of the ice sheets not changing globally over time, but that's getting sciencey. But if you just say the trees underneath the glaciers are 1,200 years old, so please shut up until you do some more reading. I go with the freight train. I go right. I try to knock it down hard, and I don't use the science. I use the Uranidian report.
What David is saying is don't argue with him. Okay. I think we said we'd hold this to an hour and a half. Thanks everyone for coming. Appreciate it. And thanks.